Italy is often described as a country of art, passion, and political chaos. But beneath the noise of elections, protests, and headlines, power in Italy has rarely changed hands. It moves quietly, from generation to generation, from palaces to boardrooms. And when you follow that trail far enough, it leads back to a single family, one that most Italians never talk about, yet whose decisions shape the fate of the entire nation. This is not the story of politicians or presidents. It is the story of a dynasty that learned how to survive every regime, every ideology, and every war, by always standing close to whoever was about to win. This is the story of the Agnellis. In Italy, there exists one family whose influence stretches far beyond politics or business headlines. They control brands like Ferrari, Jeep, Chrysler, and Maserati. They hold a stake in The Economist. They own a football club valued at more than $2 billion. They sit at the heart of Italy's largest bank. Collectively, their empire touches nearly a third of the Italian stock market and employs more than 360,000 people worldwide. And yet, outside of Italy, almost no one recognizes their name. The Agnellis are not simply Italy's version of the Rockefellers. Their reach goes further than wealth. They possess something far more dangerous, structural power, the kind that can decide whether an economy expands or collapses. And what makes their rise truly extraordinary is how they achieved it, by backing everyone: fascists, liberals, communists, allies, whoever history seemed to favor at that moment. So buckle in, because this is the remarkable story of how one family learned to ride every wave of power, and in doing so, came to shape the destiny of an entire country. In Italy, power rarely disappears. It is inherited, passed down through bloodlines that stretch from aristocratic estates to corporate boardrooms. A handful of families have always operated behind the curtain: the Benettons in infrastructure, the Pirellis in industry, the Berlusconis in media, but none of them ever matched the scale or endurance of the Agnellis. They became Italy's industrial nobility, builders of its most iconic companies, architects of its modern identity. They transformed industry into influence, and influence into permanence. And when you speak of the Agnellis, everything begins with one name: Fiat. Fiat was not just a car manufacturer, it became the pulse of Italy's industrial rise. Through Fiat, the Agnellis embedded themselves into nearly every corner of Italian life. At their peak, the companies under Gianni Agnelli alone accounted for nearly 8% of Italy's total GDP. Government policy often moved in quiet alignment with Fiat's needs because the two had become inseparable. But before the Agnellis became the public face of Italian capitalism, they were simply a modest family in Turin with an audacious idea: to build automobiles for a country that barely had roads. The year was 1899. Italy was still a young nation, unevenly developed. The north was racing toward industrialization, while much of the south remained agricultural and poor. Into this moment stepped Giovanni Agnelli, a former cavalry officer with a sharp eye for opportunity and a willingness to gamble on the future. While others clung to tradition, Agnelli was thinking about engines, speed, and mass production. Together with a small circle of investors, he founded Fabbrica Italiana Automobili Torino, Fiat. By 1900, the company opened its first factory. 35 workers produced just 24 cars that year. Today, that number sounds insignificant. At the time, it was revolutionary. There was no established market, no infrastructure. Giovanni Agnelli wasn't entering an industry. He was inventing one. Within 5 years, production multiplied. By 1906, Fiat was manufacturing thousands of vehicles and had already opened a dealership in New York before most Italians had ever owned a car. That same year, Fiat became a public corporation. Agnelli, who had started as a junior partner, maneuvered his way into full control. He secured patents, modernized production, and introduced early assembly line techniques that placed Fiat ahead of its European rivals. But success came with consequences. In 1908, Fiat was shaken by a financial scandal. Allegations of falsified accounts and inflated share prices triggered outrage. The entire board resigned. Giovanni Agnelli was dragged into court, accused of stock manipulation. Prosecutors failed to secure a conviction, and he walked free, but the damage was done. The scandal changed him. From that point forward, Agnelli became colder, more calculating, and far more selective in his alliances. And when World War I erupted, he did not hesitate. Fiat pivoted instantly to military production, securing government contracts and transforming its factories into the backbone of Italy's war effort. Trucks, tanks, aircraft engines, Fiat produced them all. By the height of the war, more than 30,000 workers were employed around the clock. The profits were enormous. The criticism was louder. Accusations of war profiteering mounted. Agnelli understood the danger, and so he turned to politics, specifically to a rising nationalist firebrand named Benito Mussolini. In 1914, Agnelli began quietly funding Mussolini's movement. When Fiat later came under scrutiny for its wartime earnings, Mussolini returned the favor by erasing inconvenient records. The alliance paid off handsomely. By the late 1930s, Fiat dominated Italy's industrial landscape, employing over 50,000 workers. When World War II began, those same factories once again shifted to wartime production, this time for Mussolini's fascist regime, and later for Nazi Germany as well. But history was turning. As the war swung against the Axis, Giovanni Agnelli adjusted his tone. Sympathy toward the Allies began to surface. It was not ideology, it was survival. In 1945, Italian authorities temporarily seized Agnelli assets for collaboration with fascism. But the punishment was brief. Fiat was simply too essential to dismantle. The economy could not function without it. And that survival cleared the path for the next chapter. After the war, control passed to Giovanni's grandson, Gianni Agnelli. By 1963, he was managing director. 3 years later, chairman and CEO. He quickly became the most powerful industrialist in Western Europe. Under his leadership, Fiat carried Italy out of wartime ruin and into modernity. Gianni Agnelli believed ideology was irrelevant when profit was at stake. In the middle of the Cold War, he partnered with the Soviet Union to build a factory capable of producing over 500,000 cars a year. It was a clear message: money moved faster than politics. Fiat went global. Its factories stretched from Moscow to Sao Paulo. Ferrari, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, Maserati, all absorbed into the empire. By the end of his reign, Fiat had won 7 European Car of the Year awards and employed over 200,000 people. 1 in 5 Italian manufacturing jobs depended directly or indirectly on Fiat. Entire cities revolved around its production lines. But Gianni Agnelli learned a painful lesson when he attempted to acquire France's Citroën. Despite advanced negotiations, French President Charles de Gaulle personally blocked the deal. Fiat was allowed only a minority stake. It was then the Agnellis understood a critical truth. Owning factories was not enough. Control over stories mattered. From that moment, their power began shifting, from machines to media, from production lines to public opinion. Gianni took the first step with newspapers. His grandson, John Elkann, took it global. And that is where the next chapter begins. By the middle of the 2010s, the Agnellis had already mastered Italian media, but their ambitions no longer stopped at national borders. In 2015, Exor, the family's holding company, acquired 43.4% of the Economist group. With that single move, the Agnellis stepped into one of the most influential information networks on the planet. The Economist is not just a magazine, it is a signal. Its reporting feeds directly into the thinking of investors, policymakers, central bankers, and executives. Markets react to its tone. Governments read its analysis to measure global sentiment. Debates launched in its pages often echo weeks later inside ministries and boardrooms. Through this platform, the Agnellis gained something Italy alone could never give them: a global voice. Media ownership at this level is not about censorship. It is about framing, about which stories matter, which risks are emphasized, which ideas feel inevitable. Much like Rupert Murdoch's influence in Britain or the Rothschilds' historical grip on financial publishing, the Agnellis learned that perception itself can be a form of power. But shaping headlines was only one layer of the strategy. While their media footprint expanded quietly, the family had already been working to embed itself deeper into Europe's institutional core. As early as 1983, Alberto Agnelli helped establish the European Roundtable of Industrialists, an elite lobbying group designed to link corporate power directly to decision-makers in Brussels. It was the clearest signal yet that Fiat's ambitions had moved beyond manufacturing cars. The goal now was to shape the rules of the market itself. That evolution became unmistakable in 2016. That year, Exor transferred its legal and fiscal headquarters to the Netherlands. Officially, the move was explained as a step toward a simpler corporate structure and a more international identity. In practice, it meant freedom, fewer regulatory constraints, greater flexibility over capital, and insulation from Italy's rigid corporate framework. Exor was no longer merely an Italian powerhouse. It had transformed into a European holding company with the ability to move wherever opportunity appeared. The impact of that decision became visible years later. By 2024, Exor had acquired a 10.1% stake in Clarivate, a New York-listed data and analytics firm whose products guide decisions for universities, corporations, and governments alike. That stake could rise as high as 17%. In a world increasingly governed by data, where information determines investment flows, research priorities, and policy direction, the Agnellis position themselves precisely where raw data turns into power. This is not passive ownership. Access to these systems allows the family to identify emerging sectors before they become public trends. Pharmaceuticals, artificial intelligence, intellectual property markets. They can observe where funding is moving, where regulation is heading, and which industries are about to receive political backing, then align their investments accordingly. By spreading influence across health, technology, energy, and industrial firms, they quietly gained leverage over some of Europe's most sensitive policy debates. And yet, true dominance is never built on numbers alone. It is built on loyalty, on emotion, on identity. The Agnellis understood this long before most corporate dynasties did. Cultural influence, they knew, lasts longer than profit. Their move into Italy's emotional core began more than a century ago. In 1923, Edoardo Agnelli became president of Juventus. At the time, football was more than a sport, it was a unifying force in a fragmented nation. North and South, rich and poor, factory workers and elites all gathered behind the same colors. Every victory built loyalty. Every trophy reinforced admiration. Over generations, from Gianni to Umberto to Andrea, the bond between Juventus and the Agnelli name deepened. Success on the field became symbolic of authority off it. The family did not just own a team, they occupied a place in Italy's collective pride. Later came Ferrari. In 1969, Fiat acquired 50% of the legendary manufacturer. The move was strategic. Fiat represented mass mobility. Ferrari represented aspiration. Together, they connected the working class to luxury, industry to desire. Over time, Fiat expanded its control, and by 1988, it held 90% of Ferrari, including shares once owned by Enzo Ferrari himself. When Ferrari eventually went public, the IPO attracted enormous attention, not because of the numbers, but because of the symbolism. Ferrari had become more than a brand. It stood for precision, excellence, and exclusivity, and that prestige reflected back onto the Agnellis themselves. Through Exor and an agreement with Piero Ferrari, the family retained 48.1% of voting power. Full ownership was no longer necessary. Control was built into the structure. Even in sport, the pattern repeated. Juventus's golden era from the 1980s through the 2010s mirrored Fiat's industrial dominance. Victories in stadiums and factories carried the same signature. By this point, conquering Italy's passions was no longer enough. The final frontier was Europe's rulebook. John Elkann inherited this legacy with a different style. Calm, reserved, rarely overtly political, yet behind closed doors few major industrial decisions in Europe unfold without brushing against his influence. As head of Exor, Elkann oversees an empire valued at roughly 40 billion euros, stretching from Milan to Amsterdam and beyond. But money alone no longer defines power. Real authority lies in proximity to decision-making, in closed-door forums, think tanks, foundations, and elite business councils, spaces where policy is discussed long before it becomes law. Elkann learned from families like the Wallenbergs and the Pritzkers how wealth becomes permanence, how networks replace headlines, how influence survives elections. Through these circles, the Agnellis continue to shape debates on green technology, industrial competitiveness, and mobility across the European Union. In the end, their story is not about cars or football clubs, it is about patience, about understanding that power does not need visibility. From Turin to Brussels, the Agnellis moved from building machines to shaping narratives, policies, and markets. They outlived monarchies, dictatorships, and political movements, without ever holding public office. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Is modern Europe truly governed by democratic choice, or by dynasties that simply never disappeared?